When you're thinking of a horror movie involving Jeff Goldblum, you're probably not thinking Mr. Frost. However, that's the movie we are talking about today. Mr. Frost, a 1990 movie directed by Philippe Setbon and stars Jeff Goldblum as the aforementioned Mr. Frost. You've also got Kathy Baker and Alan Bates rounding out the cast there. Now, this is a psychological horror movie in its purest form. There's no gory set pieces, you don't see any kills on screen, anything like that. It's purely a psychologically driven thriller horror movie. But what is the story? Well, Mr. Frost, played by Goldblum, is a serial killer who gets arrested at the beginning of the movie. And he seems to be not putting up any type of fight, not denying he hasn't done anything, and it just seems to be happens across that he ends up kind of getting arrested. Cut to 2 years later, he's in a mental institution and he only wants to speak to this one specific doctor. And we learn that Mr. Frost envisions himself as the devil himself, and he is trying to convince this particular doctor that he is in fact the devil. The thing is, he may actually be the devil. Now, what will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So, let us discuss Mr. Frost and what worked in this movie. This is a movie that I owned on VHS when it was out in its kind of rental days, and I actually quite enjoyed it back in the the early 90s when I had picked it up. And a lot of that is down to the performance of Jeff Goldblum, who is mesmerising in this role, I have to say. It's a really interesting role here. And whenever Jeff Goldblum is on screen doing his Mr. Frost shtick, as you might say, it's really kind of a fascinating kind of character study. And, he's a character who seems to be from a kind of a wealthy background, but there's no kind of, in this movie, there's no kind of record of him. He doesn't exist on kind of paper. And, he seems to casually admit to killing 24 people in a horrific manner, and is intent on, essentially kind of wanting this particular kind of female psychiatrist to believe that he's the devil. And for his motivations, he ultimately wants to bring down science, which he feels is diluting people's faith and things like this. So we have a kind of a theology versus kind of science psychological kind of battle between this psychiatrist and Mr. Frost himself. So I think Jeff Goldblum really does kind of give a very kind of calm, cool waters run deep kind of style performance here, where he seems very affable, quite kind of charming, you might say, on the surface. But the way this kind of movie is, his performance in the movie, you can tell there's menace there, but he's so charismatic on screen at the same time. So Goldblum is a real kind of plus in this scene. Now, also to add to that, there are some kind of quite neat effects in regards to cinematography here. Now, this isn't a completely effects-free movie, really. But what the movie does do is have some quite creative kind of lighting at times to create the air of menace, to just suggest kind of malice behind eyes and kind of things like this. So I think the cinematography here does help the movie a long way, as does I think the soundtrack. Soundtrack also is pretty good. And for a movie that doesn't really have any type of kind of real on-screen horror, no action, no on-screen kills, nothing kind of overtly kind of serial killery or satanic, really. It's still an interesting movie in regards to its plot, and you want to see the end result. And again, I think primarily that's driven down to Goldblum's performance for the most part, because he makes for such an interesting kind of character here. I think some of the other characters do have their moments, shall we say, but for the most part, I think this movie really kind of lives or dies on the shoulders of Goldblum here in a really sublime role, to be honest with you. However, therein lies the issue where we kind of have scenes that do not involve Goldblum, because unfortunately I feel the rest of the movie that surrounds it is at best average. Now the acting outside of Goldblum, and there's a couple of scenes where I think there are some okay acting, but there is also some legitimately horrible acting in this movie. And there's a reasonable amount of it, you know, not including kind of Goldblum, who I think is great within the movie, but there's some smaller kind of roles, some smaller kind of characters that give some horrendous performances, and also even our kind of like our main kind of protagonist character, so to speak, I think has at best a kind of a varied performance. So the acting here isn't particularly kind of strong through the cast, and therefore it unfortunately deflates some of the drama that is involved here, particularly kind of when, as I say, Goldblum is not on screen. And I have to say, I don't think the script is particularly kind of strong. For example, our kind of female psychiatrist seems to, I think, believe a little bit too kind of quickly and easily that Goldblum's character is in fact a kind of the devil, shall we say, considering her profession. And considering that obviously we've seen things in the movie that she hasn't seen, and it's set up to us to be this kind of a supernatural thing. But even with us as the audience, it still plays it a little bit ambiguous, I would argue. But for her to kind of, I think, believe it so readily, with very little kind of pushback, to be honest with you, was a little unbelievable. And I think it actually does not help the character, and they make a big point of saying she's the only female psychiatrist in this kind of hospital, and I don't think it really helps. That it kind of makes her character seem a little weak and a little bit easily manipulated. That wasn't the intention of the movie. In actual fact, the intention of the movie was that she's so staunch in science and stuff that Goldblum's character feels like she's a worthy adversary, so to speak, and that's kind of why he targets her. But I think the script actually does the opposite and kind of makes her kind of seem somewhat of a weaker character and a little bit too easily kind of influenced by what he's doing. Because there's some strange stuff that happens, but there's nothing too outlandish that it couldn't be explained by coincidence. You could argue that it has almost like a Silence of the Lambs vibe in a way with Hannibal Lecter and Clarice and stuff, but for someone who is a medical profession, and particularly in kind of psychiatry, I just think she kind of bites a little bit too easily. There's a few other things here and there with sort of characters that I don't think was particularly kind of fleshed out, and certain characters maybe we say a little bit too long with. I didn't think weren't particularly kind of pertinent to the plot and things like that. And as much as I do like some of the cinematography, there are some times here where I think some of the technical aspects and the kind of what we see on screen is a little bit on the kind of the weaker side. The very beginning of the kind of the intro, we have these two burglars break into Mr. Frost's home, and this is how ultimately he ends up getting arrested. And there's all like dry ice and stuff in his home. I think, why would there be dry ice in his home? And it's kind of like it looks a little bit silly. It looks like a music video, to be honest. So there's kind of a few kind of decisions here that I think undercut some of the kind of the otherwise great kind of psychological kind of drama and back and forth that this movie has. Now, without Goldblum's kind of performance, I feel this would be a pretty forgettable movie. But I do think Goldblum does elevate this film to become quite watchable, and you kind of want to see where his character ends up, and you are interested in, seeing what happens to him and how he is kind of dealing with, situations. I would have liked to have seen him have, quite frankly, more of a challenge. I think he kind of gets what he wants a little bit too easily, and I don't think it undercuts, as I say, the dramatic tension from this psychiatrist, but it is what it is, I suppose. But I do think Goldblum does elevate this to at least pretty much an above average movie, albeit not a high one. So I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.